This channel is part of the History Hit network.
Our British history is rich with tales of wealth and power and all that political nonsense. The glamour of our kings and queens, the jewels and furs and charisma, and all those heads being chopped off. But what about the real people who made everything happen? Rig Boer! I'll discover what they ate. It's a bit dodgy. The challenges they faced. Stuff this for a game of soldiers. And how they built Britain. That's straight as a die. I'm going to uncover the extraordinary lives of some of history's ordinary people. Romans, it's quite a weight on my head, I have to say. Edwardians.
Breathe in, madam, breathe in.
1950s.
Put the needle on the record.
Ooh, really soft brakes, takes ages to stop it. And the Middle Ages. There's the executive model inside the house. Whatever. History from the bottom up. This time, I'm going back nearly 2,000 years to the great Roman Empire. An empire that stretched all the way from Egypt to Hadrian's Wall and brought people from Europe, Asia and Africa to live here, in gloomy old Britain. A couple of thousand years ago, there was no better way of seeing the world than by joining the Roman army. Although it could be a bit of a lottery. For one young man, let's call him Marcus, this would have meant travelling thousands of miles just so he could do guard duty at a forlorn outpost of the empire in a distant and uncivilised place called Britannia. This is going to be our Marcus. He came from the other end of the empire in Africa. In search of adventure, he would have taken a boat from his homeland along the Nile sometime around the year 200 AD. Adventure, Marcus? You want to join the Roman army? OK. Change at Cairo and take a chariot west across the desert till you see a lot of blokes with spears. Great.
What a mug.
The Romans had been in North Africa for centuries, and Africans travelled around the empire as soldiers, traders and emperors. But the army didn't take just anybody. To qualify, Marcus had to be solid and strong, alert, straight-necked and broad-chested. But it didn't matter how many fingers he had. Some lads had tried to avoid conscription by chopping a couple off, but the army wasn't having that. So having proved he was a sturdy country lad with 8 to 10 fingers, Marcus had to swear to obey the emperor and never run away from the army or the enemy. Then he was in. Every morning after a hearty breakfast of a pound of bacon, Marcus worked out with a wooden sword, which sounds rubbish, but it was heavier than a real sword, to make him even more big and strong. Then he was dispatched over 3,000 miles from his homeland to Blighty, Rome's most northerly colony for over 150 years. Now, you might think that being a Roman soldier simply meant getting into well-formed units and then smashing the daylights out of the barbarians. But there was actually far more to it than that, as Marcus and his mates would soon discover. For a start, there was the marching. You had to march for up to 24 miles a day, which is certainly a lot more than the 4,587 steps I've taken so far. And if there wasn't a road where they wanted to go, Marcus and his comrades would just have to build one. So how did that work?
History Hit is like Netflix just for history fans, with exclusive history documentaries covering some of the most famous people and events in history, just for you. Whether you're looking to dive into life and crime in Victorian London, or the forgotten history that deserves to be heard, History Hit has a documentary for you, just a click away. We're committed to bringing history fans award-winning documentaries and podcasts that you can't find anywhere else. Sign up now for a free trial, and Absolute History fans get 50% off their first 3 months. Just be sure to use the code AbsoluteHistory at checkout.
This is historian Dr. Simon Elliott. Is it true that there were virtually no roads in England prior to the Romans coming, and then they banged in a whole lot of roads, many of which are today's A roads?
Absolutely, yeah. If you look at the landscape of Britain today, you look at all the A roads, they're all the lines of Roman roads. You think of Watling Street, which is the line of the A2 and the A5. You think of the A1, which is Ermine Street, and its extension from York going into Scotland, which is Deer Street. These are all Roman roads built by Roman legionaries.
They were serious roads with drainage and layered with rocks, gravel and sand. The luxury version even had cobbles. So how did they make them so straight? Well, Marcus may have had to be handy with one of these strange contraptions, a gromer.
All you have to do is sight yourself on that plumb line, go through the central plumb line, and lock onto that plumb line.
Oh, yeah, and then you stick your stick in over there somewhere.
You just tell me where to go, Tony.
OK, let's have a go.
So if I stop here, Tony, for the first stick, you tell me left or right.
Right. Just slightly that way. Yep, bang on.
There's the first one.
Yeah.
Then I go a little bit further.
Yeah. Well, a gnat's knee that way. Oh, too far. That was an elephant's knee. Just a tiny bit right. Whoa, that's straight as a die.
There we are, a Roman road.
Yeah. How long do you reckon it would take to build a bit of Roman road from here to those trees over there? That's about 100 metres, I would think.
To build 100 metres, probably 40 man-hours. So if you had 40 men, 40 legionaries, then it would take 1 hour.
That's staggering, isn't
I know.
it? Is it fair to say that the soldiers in the Roman army were half fighting men and half builders?
Absolutely spot on. So if you look at the typical Roman legion of 5,500 men, you would have maybe 4,500 as the full-fat legionaries with his shield, his helmet, his javelins, his gladius hispaniensis sword. But this legionary was also a fully trained engineer. So he didn't just carry that kit, he always carried his engineering kit as well. And then within the legion, the other 1,000 were also specialists. So you had stonemasons, you had carpenters, you had surveyor.
I joined the army for the killing, not the building. Yeah, stuff this for a game of soldiers. Marcus's unit was on its way to Hadrian's Wall, which had been built over 50 years before to protect Roman Britain from the tribes of Caledonians and Picts. His destination? Some drafty fort facing sleet and snow. We've got a remarkably vivid idea of what life would have been like for someone like Marcus from some fantastic archaeological finds that were found at a place called Vindolanda on Hadrian's Wall. These are copies, they're letters, and they're written on wood rather than parchment, because parchment would have been very hard to come by. And they've got in them some lovely details, like there's a request for more beer, and there's another request for warmer underpants, which I can quite understand. And there's one which describes the local people as Little Britons, which I suppose is meant to be derogatory, although quite honestly, I'm quite proud of being a Little Briton. Marcus also had a reputation for being a bit of a buffoon, which probably kept his mates entertained in the long winter nights. But one day in 208 AD, there was a surprising sight. The Roman emperor turned up. This is him, Septimius Severus, the 21st to rule since the empire was first founded in 27 BC, and who also happened to be the first African Roman emperor. Severus was a hard man who turned the empire into a military monarchy. When Marcus met him, the emperor's mind was on the war in the north. Severus wanted to sort out the problem of the troublesome Scots once and for all, but he needed to boost his defences first, and that meant that Marcus and his comrades would need to rebuild the forts all the way along the wall. Another massive, back-breaking job. It was all go in the Roman army. Despite their practical approach to life, Romans were extremely superstitious. Before launching an attack, Emperor Severus wanted to know what the future held. This could be done by reading patterns in nature, like the way birds flocked, or in lightning, or even in the entrails of sacrificed chickens. One day the emperor was inspecting Marcus's fort, and being a Roman, he was really superstitious, so he was looking round for some kind of sign or omen which would guide him to victory. And it was at that point that Marcus stepped into the history books. This history book, to be precise, Roman historian Augusta described an incident involving the emperor and an African soldier. And he had got this wreath of cypress leaves, and he said, "Emperor, you are a god. Mind you, for a human being to be a god, you have to die first. So, sorry about that." And as you can imagine, there was absolute silence, and the emperor was not amused and sent the man out of his sight. We don't know what happened to Marcus after his ill-timed joke. He would have been lucky to get away with his life. As for Severus, he died in York in 211 AD. At which point the Romans suddenly lost interest in Scotland. But Severus had left one legacy which Marcus may just have benefited from. Before Severus died, he changed the law so that soldiers could marry local girls. And when they retired, they either got a little pension or a piece of land. So I like to think that provided Marcus wasn't executed for impertinence or killed fighting the Scots, he would have married the local girl and settled down. And maybe to this very day, his descendants are still living somewhere just outside Carlisle. At the other end of Roman Britain, it started as a small trading post on the Thames, London. Londinium was its original name. That was a Roman town. London, oh, London. These were the original Londoners. Nice cup of rosy, Lee. Roman London grew fast and soon became a vital trading hub for the empire. Around about the year AD 90, a young girl called Fortunata made this journey up the Thames. But she wasn't selling anything, it was herself that was on sale. Fortunata was a slave. This could be her. Fortunata means lucky, which sounds like a cruel joke. She may have been either captured by the Romans or sold to them by her parents. She was from Gaul, modern-day France, which to her must now have seemed very far away. Roman London was crammed, with a population of around 60,000. The riverside would have been bustling and noisy, with languages being spoken from all over the Roman Empire. A pound of your finest Sistine Chapels, please. But there wouldn't have been any time for sightseeing for Fortunata. She'd have been shoved down the street, probably stumbling from the weight of the manacles on her hands and her feet. And she must have feared the worst. Fortunata was on her way to be sold. Today we might associate slavery with the trade in African people taken by force to work in the Americas. But humans have been enslaving each other for thousands of years, and the Roman Empire was no different. It depended on slaves, who made up about 20% of the population. Romans were happy to make anyone a slave, whether they came from Africa, Asia, or Europe. Slaves didn't only do tough physical jobs either. They could be accountants, actors, scribes, or financiers dealing with huge amounts of money. But their individual lives are shrouded in mystery. So how did we find out about Fortunata? Did we just make her up? No, we didn't. It was a great piece of archaeological detective work. During modern excavations near the Thames, one sharp-eyed archaeologist spotted this: a wax writing tablet. Except, unfortunately, the wax had disappeared. Originally, it would have looked something like this. This is a tablet that a scribe would have used in Roman times to write on. You see it's made of wood, and this black inside is black wax. And the scribe would write Fortunata into the wax, and that was the message. If the wax didn't survive, neither would the message. Except, fortunately for us, there was one particular scribe who was very heavy-handed. How do we know? Well, examination of the wooden frame revealed the imprint of his stylus, enhanced in this replica. He pushed so hard that he gouged into the wood all the words that he was writing. So you can actually read them today. And they reveal that this is the bill of sale of the slave girl Fortunata to a chap called Vegetus, who was a slave of another slave. It says, Vegetus, assistant slave of Montanus, who was also the slave of the august emperor, has bought and received the girl Fortunata for 600 denarii, which is quite a lot of money at that time. And she's in good health, and she won't wander or run away. The sale would have been a humiliating process, which probably involved Fortunata being stripped for inspection by Vegetus. Her price was equivalent to 2 years' salary for a Roman legionary, suggesting a highly attractive young woman, one who probably offered special skills, such as cookery. Fortunata's owner, Vegetus, had been given this money by his owner in a sort of trust. He could use it to buy whatever he wanted, even a slave for himself, so that one day, if Vegetus earned his freedom, he could set up home and, if he chose, marry his slave girl. For now, though, Fortunata belonged to whoever owned Vegetus. So she probably went to work in some kind of high-status official residence, maybe not unlike this one. As a top-end slave, Fortunata might have been given duties looking after the lady of the house. Oh, cheer up, girl, for goodness sake. She'd have had her own quarters with the other slaves. But she wouldn't have had all the luxury of underfloor heating and tiled floors and all the things we normally associate with Roman villas. She would have lived round the back or in the next field in quarters which were pretty cramped and basic. She and the other slaves would be expected to run the place so that it was self-sufficient, including growing all of their food. And doubtless she'd have brought some of her fancy French cooking skills with her. Caroline Nicolet is French and an expert in Roman cookery. Oh, Caroline, I can smell this from the other side of the room. Oh, it's really lovely, isn't it?
Oh, thank you.
Should I have a taste?
Yes, please, absolutely. So this is called a minuto exprès coquis, which is a pork and apricots stew, if you like.
Oh, it's very nice. It's me talking my mouth, it's a bit hot. But it really is that combination of the sweetness of the apricots and the meatiness of the pork. Gorgeous.
It's very much like a Moroccan tagine, if you like.
But what is it about this Roman stew that makes it so irresistible?
It's the fish sauce that we call garum.
Garum is a sauce made by fermenting fish. It's old dead fish that you lay out on the beach for days and the cats come and wee on it?
It is a smelly affair. It's mainly the guts or the heads and all that are thrown in, left to ferment with a lot of salt in the sun, in the heat, etc. for about at least 3 months.
Yeah.
So Fortunata herself wouldn't get any of it?
Except if she cooks it and working in the kitchen, you might have leftovers, but you won't be served that as part of your daily meal.
If Fortunata was brought here as a cook, what products would she be able to cook with?
There's apricots. We can't have them fresh in Britain, so they will have to be dried, preserved in honey.
What about these cucumbers?
We don't have cucumbers, as far as we know, in Britain before the Roman conquest. Say the 1st century BC, that's where things and fashions really begin to change.
Onions here, they would have been originally English, wouldn't they?
No, they are imported. That's really odd for us now to think about a cuisine without onions.
Yeah.
But as far as we know, before the Roman conquest, all types of allium are very Mediterranean.
Before the Romans arrived, the Brits relied on a simple diet of meat, barley, beans and root vegetables. Fortunata, I've always thought of her as a victim, but actually, at least for some of the time, she would have been doing quite well, being surrounded by exotic food, probably having a little bit herself, maybe getting a bit of respect from the fact that she cooked so well.
Yeah, absolutely. Just the fact that she is so expensive. She's a very respected slave because you are an asset to the estate.
It's horrible, isn't it, to think about the lack of freedom and the gross exploitation that Fortunata and slaves like her would have suffered from. But I like to think that Fortunata might actually have lived up to her name and been lucky. After all, she was alive. It seems as though she was living in quite a comfortable place. Maybe she ended up marrying Vegetus and they had a couple of kids and they became free and were happy ever after. I hope so. When the Romans invaded Britain, they brought with them all sorts of radical new ideas. Some of them even more exciting than either roads or the Mediterranean diet. Like, for instance, showbiz. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen.
And welcome to the show tonight.
The Romans worked hard and they played hard. Among the impressive buildings that they built, or got their slaves to build, were amphitheatres, circuses, stadiums and theatres. Roman theatre was inspired by classical Greek plays and mainly consisted of dramas that were either tragedies or comedies. They were performed by actors wearing costumes and masks to convey character. And although we don't exactly know which plays were performed in Britain, we do at least know one place where they were performed. This is the best preserved theatre in Roman Britain at Verulamium in Hertfordshire. Back in Roman times, it would have been an entertainment hotspot with something for all the family. But who were the stars of Roman Britain? Well, we've got one fantastic clue which contains two intriguing names. The clue is this gorgeous terracotta piece of pottery, and the names are Veracunda Ludia and Lucius Gladiator. Veracunda the actress and Lucius the gladiator. This is a replica of the original, which was discovered in Leicester. The small hole allowed it to be hung as a pendant, surely a love token. What we're looking at is a showbiz couple from Roman Britain. And first, I'm going in search of Veracunda's story. Much as they enjoyed their entertainment, respectable Romans looked down on actresses like Veracunda, who almost certainly would have been a slave anyway. She would have had to be a great actor, dancer and mime artist. And if these mosaics are anything to go by, pander to the bawdy expectations of the audience. She would have been part of a troupe of travelling entertainers, performing at venues up and down Roman Britain. For them, Verulamium would have been a big tour date. This area here, where all the grass is now, rectangular space, would have been the stage, and they wouldn't just have had this one pillar. There would have been 1, 2, 3, maybe even 4, and behind them would have been some kind of cloth or curtain to act as the scenery, and over here, that's where the musicians would have played. Behind them, you've got this curve all the way around. That's where the audience sat, and they'd have had tickets. They'd have been lead tokens which would have been stamped on the way in. And what about Verecunda? Well, when she was waiting for the show to start, she would have been up in the preparation room, what we call the green room nowadays. This is where she would have been getting a bit worked up, wondering how tonight was going to go, hanging up her frocks and dusting off her dresses. I'm hoping that Reading University's Roman expert, Dr. Matthew Nichols, can reveal a bit more of Verecunda's world. What do you think of that name, Verecunda?
It does have a meaning in Latin, which is, we could say something like modesty. And her name is first. It's before Lucius the Gladiator. So they seem to me to be probably a couple, I would have thought. It looks to me like something these two people cared about and thought about.
If you and I were here for an evening's entertainment and Verecunda was up on stage, what would we be likely to see?
I suspect if it's a troupe that's got a ludia in it, an actress, that we're looking at mime, which might be a series of almost farcical performances, caricatured situations from daily life. There might be song numbers and dance numbers and so on. It could be something a bit more raunchy. It could be something a bit more highbrow.
Who would be watching it? Just the people who lived in the villas or the ordinary people and the goat herds?
If you look around at the building, it's a pretty large structure. It could hold a lot of people. Looking around, I would say several thousand people. So that's probably most of the population of a town like St Albans, and we might imagine people coming in from the neighbourhood as well, from the surrounding villas and farms. So I suspect you'd want to appeal to the villa crowd and to the goat herd crowd.
Whatever their demographic, Romans liked an exciting end to the evening. And if the playwrights struggled to deliver a suitable climax, they could always resort to one time-honoured, if not terribly subtle, device. Sometimes a magic figure would just come in and wave a magic wand, everyone would die, end of play. This sort of ending was known in Latin as a deus ex machina, or God from the machine. But no one was really harmed, of course. It was just pretend. Verecunda could just go back to her tent and do exactly the same thing the next day. For her boyfriend, though, the action was all too real. Ruthless bloodlust was a cherished Roman value, and one they exported around the empire to colonies such as Britain. This was the world of Verecunda's boyfriend, Lucius. Lucius was a gladiator. Britain may have been a far-flung province, but the Romans here had to have their games. They were very serious about their entertainment. You could say deadly serious. Britain had its own modest versions of Rome's theatre of death. Today, they've either been turned into shady glades or attractive traffic islands. But don't be fooled, the games were just as nasty. They were put on for free by wealthy politicians or businessmen wanting to curry favour with the locals. Men and even women would often fight to the death in front of the baying crowds. I love you, lad. Come on if you think you're hard enough. Ooh. During Lucius's time in the 2nd century, defeated gladiators weren't always executed, but very few lasted more than 10 fights. It's hard to imagine anything more awful, isn't it? But the games were extremely popular, both with the Romans and with the Romano-British. So how did Lucius end up with a career as a gladiator? Well, we can be fairly certain that this wasn't his preferred career choice. Lucius was most likely an enemy combatant, captured from one of the British tribes and then offered a choice to either A, be executed. I don't really like that one. Or B, be enslaved and fight as a gladiator. Lucius's life was all about survival and fighting for a living and being prepared to kill, and the centre of his world would have been his training, into which I'm about to get a crash course. First, I suppose I best get myself kitted out. This is quite bizarre. This is like a Roman car boot sale, isn't it?
Very much so. A gladiator car boot sale, maybe.
John Conyard is a professional reenactor. It looks like all this stuff is designed to make it difficult to fight in. There's a whole variety of different kinds of headgear here.
All the helmets are made of a copper alloy, sometimes covered in tin.
It's quite a weight on the head, I have to say.
The fight certainly won't last very long. Certainly in some of the helmets, they're deliberately got small eye holes, so it's going to be hard to breathe.
I like this wonky sword. What would the function of that have been?
So with a sword like this, I can slide it over the shield, inside the collarbone to the heart. I can place it on your breastbone, turn it around, and then slide it upwards through the bottom of your chin, up into your brain pan.
Look at this. You wouldn't want one of these up your bits and pieces, would you? The four-skewer dagger was devastating against knee or elbow joints. On the days when Lucius wasn't fighting, what would he have been doing?
If he was a young gladiator, I suspect he might have been kept to barracks, almost chained up in his room or in the gladiator school. After he's had some experience and he becomes a higher status gladiator, he might be allowed into town where he could meet actresses.
How often would they fight?
Certainly once to maybe 8 times a year.
I thought it would have been more like football and you would have turned out once a week.
They were paid very large sums of money for a bout, anything from maybe £75,000 to £250,000 in our terms. So fighting 1 or 2 bouts a year would be an excellent way of having a very good living in the Roman Empire.
For Lucius, the secret to a good performance was not only to be handy in a scrap, but also to get into character. Each gladiator played a different role and had his own arch enemy. What with his glamorous girlfriend Veracunda, I reckon Lucius was a pretty boy gladiator, like this chap. Known as a retiarius or a netman, he had no helmet, so he could show off his good looks. His arch enemy was the secutor, well armed but slow. So what's Tom doing here?
Oh, Tom's playing a gladiator for us. You could take off the
John's son Tom is dressed as a secutor.
So the retiarius would be practically unarmoured.
Yeah.
They're using the trident, the fishing spear. It's a very powerful weapon. I can use it two-handed.
Oh, hang on, it's a demonstration. You're right.
Not too bad.
The net would be weighted, lead weights all the way around the outside. And, of course, we could try to throw the net in such a way to bring him down. So you are the fisherman who has caught the fish.
Yes. With a high-energy diet and a programme of rigorous training every day, Lucius prepared for his next big fight. When it came to the day of the games, the whole thing would unfold a bit like a circus in a series of acts. And if it was a really classy show, then it would be accompanied by a soundtrack played by musical instruments, just like a sort of horror movie. And Lucius would watch from the wings as the old warm-up acts came on and got the audience in the mood. But I'm not really talking about a cheeky chappie in a spangly jacket. First on were the bestiarius fighters, criminals given spears to have a sporting chance against very hungry big cats. After the ferocious hungry animals, there'd probably be a few executions just to get the audience's bloodlust up. Then it's Lucius's call. He's had a few fights before, so by now he's well known, well seasoned and popular. And here comes the star of the show. Lucius the Retiarius. And a great reaction from the crowd. The secutor is straight in at Lucius with a chop to the head. But Lucius easily dodges out of the way. Quick, elegant movements. Lucius makes the lumbering Rex look a bit ridiculous. Oh, another swipe from Rex. That was closer. Now, Lucius has come in on his blind side and it's back of the net. The crowd is going wild. Oh, my word. Was it really this bloody? Or is that just something we see in the movies? Well, not far from the prim tea rooms of York, archaeologists recently discovered evidence for a huge English gladiators' graveyard.
80 bodies, nearly all men, mostly killed in horrible ways.
Including one whose bones showed he'd been savaged by a big cat, presumably brought to Britannia for the games. The end for Lucius, too, was most probably brutal and grim.
We all know something about gladiators, don't we? The strange helmets and the weird weapons and the nets. In fact, they're so bizarre, they're almost reduced to oddities, aren't they, rather than human beings? And it's only when we learn the name of one of them or see their butchered skeletons that we realise that they were people just like us, with lives like ours, but with terrible, brutal deaths.
In Roman Britain, locals who became part of Roman society often did so as slaves, whether they were cooks, actresses, or gladiators. But how about the Brits who didn't get taken into slavery? What were their lives like? And are there even any records of them?
Well, we do have a name, and it comes from the village of Prickwillow on the island of Eels, which is now Ely in Cambridgeshire. And that name is Boderoginus, which roughly translates as born of victory. But whose victory? Well, it could well be Queen Boudica, who was the tribe chief who smashed the Romans on a number of occasions. So calling your child born of victory could well be two fingers up to the Roman Empire.
Cheeky little Britain. So did Boderoginus live up to his name? Well, not exactly. However, he did find a way of dealing with the Romans on his own terms. You see,
Boderoginus had a job which gave him special value. It was one which would have made the other members of the tribe look at him with a bit of awe, a bit of wonder. He was someone who seemed to have something to do with magic because he could conjure beautiful things out of the earth. He was a metal worker.
this might be Boderoginus hard at work. After training under a mentor, he'd have become a travelling artisan or had a shop in the village. But Boderoginus soon became an artist of the highest calibre. We know about him because one of his products, made in the 2nd century AD, was unearthed in a bog near the village of Prickwillow. And it's kept in pride of place at the British Museum.
This is stunning. This strange-looking thing looks like a little saucepan to me. What's so lovely about it is these exquisite patterns on it.
Dolphins playing, sea beasts with scaly tails, and what looks like a cupid popping up in the middle of it all.
It's just beautiful. Richard, help me out. What am I looking at?
Dr. Richard Hobbs is Western Curator of Roman Britain.
In some ways, the most important bit is the inscription that you can just see here.
Yeah, is that a B there?
Boderoginus, and then a dot, and then the letter F.
Oh, F, yeah. Yeah, I know what that is. It's like fabricated, made.
Yeah, we know the name of the craftsman who made this extraordinary thing.
Can I feel it?
Yeah, you can. Yeah.
Wow, it's got a bit of heft to it.
It does. It's quite
a... What is it actually made out of?
It's made out of copper alloy. So it's made of copper alloyed with other things. Now, we certainly know there's tin here. That's why it's got this greyish look to the inner part of the bowl. And there are some tiny traces of enamel, which is like a type of glass.
The metal alloys would first have been cast in clay moulds, then the detail refined by delicate filing and engraving with tiny tools.
Boduogenus is clearly a very skilled and experienced man, isn't he?
Yeah, he's really working at the top of his profession. He also knows a lot about Roman classical imagery, so he's clearly learnt the kind of artistic side of it as well as the skills needed to make this.
And Boduogenus used his knowledge to create something Romans would have used in sacred religious rites. So this would have been commissioned by a priest who would have paid a lot, something like a month's salary for the average Roman legionary.
Do we know anything about the kind of ceremony that this would have been involved in?
The decoration is all about Bacchus. Bacchus is the god of wine, but he's also associated with rebirth, you know, the coming of the seasons, the good things in life.
Bacchus was a very important god to the Romans, and they held frequent festivals in his honour. In a sacred ceremony, Boduogenus' skillet would have been used to offer wine as a sort of sacrifice to the god Bacchus.
We can imagine that this is being used as part of one of those festivals, the Bacchanalia, which is all about the merrymaking surrounding Bacchus, the drinking of the wine, maybe the grape harvest itself. Once those ceremonies have been gone through, then you can all partake freely in the Bacchanalian festivals themselves.
So although this wine is sacramental and it's been blessed, you'd be able to neck it as part of the party?
Absolutely. You paid your due to the god, so you can then be satisfied that you're in harmony with the gods.
A Bacchanalia was basically an excuse to have a good time. And for some reason, this Roman god became very popular with many Brits. That's a bit chilly. Are you sure you should be going topless? What about you? Oh, yeah, I got a bit carried away, didn't I?
Do you think he would have been a respected member of his society?
Well, the funny thing is, a lot of metalworkers were not viewed in that way. They were kind of viewed with suspicion. Because of this amazing ability to, bring together something from the earth with water and fire and make these extraordinary objects.
So they were a bit magic.
They were sort of seen as alchemists.
Great at last to find evidence for how Brits could exploit the Romans. All brought together into one magnificent little saucepan by a craftsman called Boduogenus, nearly 2,000 years ago.
The Romans provoked such a mixture of emotions. Whatever the benefits of the Roman Empire, I can imagine many little Britons breathing a sigh of relief when the whole thing finally went down the toilet. This time, I'm going back 1,000 years to a time of knights in shining armour, big personality kings, a powerful church, and great clothes. Our story begins after that infamous invasion by William the Conqueror in 1066. Once the Normans stopped killing people, business boomed, and the population soon trebled to a massive 5 million. People crowded into the towns. Food production rocketed to cope. But once they'd fed their faces and those of their animals, the people of medieval Britain had to deal with the consequences.
So what to do with all the poo they produced? Well, people in the Middle Ages were renowned for chucking the contents of their chamber pots into the streets below, which were like open sewers. And there's no doubt that that happened.
Women love my singing. She'll be putty in my hands. Get lost, creep! What she meant was prenez garde l'eau, look out, water, which is where we get the word loo from.
But you'll be relieved to know this wasn't how the sum of most human waste was dealt with.
Well, moderately relieved. For most people, there would be a communal privy out back, a wooden seat suspended above a cesspit, like this 12th century model unearthed in York.
Or there's the executive model, which was actually inside the house. See, look, there's the little hole, so you just get in, do what you have to do, and bosh, it goes straight down into the cesspit.
Hurry along, mate, I've been waiting half an hour. Naturally, it was polite to check first that no one was using the economy version.
But that's not the end of the problem, is it? Because you can't dig a bottomless hole, and eventually the cesspit's going to overflow. So the question is, what do you do with all the stuff in the cesspit?
'Tis your turn to empty it. Oh, God.
The solution created a career for a special sort of person, someone like Richard Rakier. The clue is in his name. What he raked was poo. He was also known as a gong farmer. Gong as in going, like, I'm going to toilet.
This could be him. Richard's job was to harvest all that poo, load it into the back of a cart, and take it out of the city where it could be disposed of.
Even by medieval standards, the contents of Richard's barrow were pretty disgusting. So he would start work just after dark and finish at the crack of dawn, which is why he and his colleagues were known as Nightmen, and their product was rather tweely referred to as night soil.
There was a clear career progression for gong farmers.
Everyone wanted to be the tub man. He was the bloke who had a little cart with a bucket on it, and he would transfer the bucket to and from the cesspit. And below him, there was the rope man, and his job was to chuck the bucket down into the cesspit. And at the very bottom, literally, there was the hole man who went down the hole and excavated all the disgusting stuff. Oh, what a job.
There was a constant risk of cholera, a lethal bacterial disease caused by contact with infected feces. It killed around 1 million people a year worldwide. Back then, they thought the smelly air itself was dangerous. So Richard got danger money and earned a walloping 6pence a day, a whole week's wages for the average labourer. Quite tempting then. And Richard would really earn his money when it came to emptying large communal toilets in the big city. Somerset House, one of London's most fabulous buildings.
But this glorious Georgian architecture hides quite a mucky past, one which has only recently reared its disgusting head. This part of the building is the Courtauld Institute for Art, and around the corner there, they're in the process of revamping the art galleries, which, believe me, are going to be really nice.
I'm meeting project director Dr. Stephanie Hall just by where a fascinating discovery was made.
So this is what the excavation looked like when we had just started. What we actually thought that we would find was a Tudor wall, but actually it turns out that it was a cesspit.
A cesspit as in a bog?
A bog, a toilet, a cesspit.
A toilet.
Yeah. I have to say, it did get a little bit smelly as the archaeologists were digging down. Now, it's hundreds of years old, but it never loses its shine, as it were.
The builders are now busy covering it up behind their brickwork. The cesspit was part of an inn which stood here in the Middle Ages. It was lined with large chalk blocks that allowed water to gradually filter out into the Thames, leaving the waste trapped inside, for chaps like Richard to empty. Toilet seats, 2 or 3 in a row, would have been suspended above the stinking void of the pit.
Our cesspit was full of about 100 things. So here you've got a jug, some pottery. This is a boot spur and a buckle on a belt. The pottery was brown and the conservators cleaned it up.
So it would have been green like that?
It would have been green like that. So this would have been a condiment dish. So if you were eating olive, you put pits in one side and keep the olives in the other.
So you're sitting there on the loo, having your hors d'oeuvres, somebody gives you a shout, you stand up and your olives go down the Kazi.
But there's something else a little more distressing.
So the other thing we found was an entire dog skeleton, a little dog. He may have come to have a little dig and a little sniff, and maybe he fell in.
That's the saddest part of this story.
It was very sad.
Emptying this place would have been a big job, quite literally. But this wasn't the end of it. Before the night was over, Richard was supposed to carry his load out of town and deposit it with a local farmer who'd use the night soil as fertiliser.
Some unscrupulous nightmen just fly tip the stuff wherever they could, but the penalties for that could be really harsh. There was one young London gong farmer who was caught pouring effluent down a drain, and they stuck him in one of his own vessels, filled it with poo right up to his neck, and they left him in Golden Lane for everyone to see with a big sign round his neck telling them what he'd done.
I imagine Richard yearning to escape his stinking struggle of everyday life. Unfortunately, that wasn't what happened. The reason we know about Richard is that in 1326, unusually for a nightman, his death was recorded because its manner was so bizarre.
One afternoon, Richard was at home and, I don't know, maybe he was just a bit tired, wasn't quite on his game, and he realised he needed to go to the toilet. And he sat down and he'd meant to fix that toilet seat. It had been rotten for some time, but he'd never got round to it. And suddenly there was a crash and he plunged down, down, down into the cesspit. And he drowned in his own poo.
It's an odd way to become famous. In the Middle Ages, it wasn't only chaps who kicked ass.
You've probably heard about the great medieval warrior, heroine and saint Joan of Arc, who fought for the French against the English. But what you may not know is that we Brits had our own Joan, Joan of Leeds. Joan of Leeds wasn't actually a saint, and she didn't live in Leeds. She lived in the Benedictine Priory of St Clement in York in the 1300s.
As a nun, Joan was part of the most powerful organisation in medieval Europe, the Church. The countryside of the Middle Ages was positively cluttered with religious buildings. Monasteries, priories, convents. The church was a fundamental part of everyone's life. Many people worked on its land. Monasteries and convents delivered a constant vigil of prayer, but also provided hospitals and social services, and were centres of science, education, and literature.
But being a nun wasn't all fun. In fact, Joan was as miserable as hell. She was a teenager, she was a novice, and she soon realised that the whole nun thing really wasn't for her.
Joan was probably sent to the convent as a little girl to be educated by the nuns. Then in her mid-teens at some point, she apparently decided to forsake worldly things and become a novice nun.
But was it really her decision? Or was she pushed?
Joan's family would originally have come from Leeds and were reasonably well off.
I recommend the Chateaubriand. Medium rare.
Yummy. Such families didn't like too many daughters because they were extremely expensive to marry off with lavish dowries.
Oh dear.
That left one option, the convent, with a handsome donation to the abbess.
I've got overheads, you know.
While most people in the Middle Ages were trying to get out of poverty, nuns were trying to get into it.
Joan's Priory, like most at that time, followed the strict rule of St. Benedict. That meant she had to take 3 vows. Obedience to the abbess, and abbesses could be really strict, poverty for life, and chastity. No relations with men. In fact, men weren't allowed anywhere near the place.
Whatever. And that was just for starters. Joan didn't even get a lie in. Each day would begin at 2 a.m. in the chapel, with prayers, psalms, hymns, and readings. The primary role of monasteries and convents in the Middle Ages was to pray for the souls of the dead, so they'd eventually ascend into heaven. And people donated a lot of money to be prayed for. So for Joan, after a few more hours' sleep, it was up at dawn for more prayers, followed by a simple breakfast, then another service at 6 a.m, then another 4 lots of prayers, perhaps interspersed with a bit of book illuminating and odd jobs, followed by a simple supper.
Black pudding again? Yes, every day for the last 2 years.
And then prayers, lights out by 7.
For many, it was a genuine calling to which they were devoted. All I'm saying is I don't know many teenagers who'd plump for it.
To better understand Joan's plight, I'm meeting Professor Sarah Rhys-Jones, a medieval historian from the University of York.
It would have been really tough for a teenage girl to be a novice, wouldn't it?
I think it could have been really tedious because all that the nuns were required to do was to observe the religious offices throughout the day. And doing that day after day after day with the same very small group of women, there were probably fewer than 20 nuns in this convent, would have been very tedious, repetitive and claustrophobic.
It does sound like a pretty dreadful boarding school type of life.
Yes, we have plenty of evidence of nuns falling out with each other and there being sort of factions and bullying and quarrels, so there could be a lot of unhappiness in a convent as well.
How would Joan cope? Fall into line, fade away, or stand up against the system? No one could have predicted what Joan did next. Her true story has only recently come to light, recorded in the margins of an ancient document held at the University of York.
It was the year 1318. Joan had been complaining about feeling ill for months. None of the medicines they gave her seemed to work. Eventually, she took to her bed. She was there for days. She went off her food, and finally, she died. Her funeral was held, and she was buried. A tragic but all too common end to a young life.
At least that was what everyone thought.
Then, would you believe it, a few months later, Joan turned up again, 30 miles away, in Beverley, shacked up with her secret boyfriend. Was it a miracle? No, actually, some of the sisters had helped her escape by going along with the story about her being ill. They'd even buried a straw mannequin in her place. On hearing this, the Archbishop of York demanded her return to the priory.
And that was all we knew about Joan's story, until researchers in York discovered another, very different account.
One of my colleagues working on the project found another record about Joan of Leeds, and this is truly rare because it actually gives her version of the story.
That's fantastic. What's her story?
Somebody called Brother John says that he's met Joan, and that Joan says that she was committed to the nunnery underage, she had to be 13 to be a nun, against her will, and that she had never taken vows, and that therefore she shouldn't be a nun, and that was, her reason for denying her vocation. And Brother John then writes to the Archbishop saying it would be better that she were married than getting up to who knows what outside the convent.
You like this story, don't you?
Yes. Joan does come across as a woman with guts and initiative, great ingenuity, a great character.
Quite honestly, what amazes me is that so many nuns actually stayed in the convents.
Which maybe shows that there really weren't many options available for young women at that time. And that when you've got a really established system, it takes a reckless act of rebellion to break away from it, whether your name's Joan of Arc or Joan of Leeds. I think it's fair to say that in terms of civil liberties, things have progressed a bit since the Middle Ages. For example, freedom of speech. It's the cornerstone of our democracy, isn't it? We can say what we like.
The Prime Minister is a scoundrel and a liar. You might even say that we rather take it for granted.
But back in the Middle Ages, it was entirely different. There was only one person who could say what they liked to the most powerful man in the country, the king. And it wasn't the Queen. It was the royal jester.
Diddly-dee, look at me, I'm as bonkers as can be.
You see, being king wasn't all it was cracked up to be. There was constant pressure to win battles, to keep all the pushy landowners happy, and to be the life and soul of the banquet. All while keeping an eye on the power-grabbing church,
Heresy!
the revolting peasants, and that self-important son of yours who has his eyes on your hat.
Being a king was exhausting, stressful, and frankly, really depressing. What you needed was someone to burst the bubble of all that stress. And that's exactly what the jester's job was, to be outrageous, to do and say the unthinkable.
Your Majesty, your wondrous Majesty.
If we may beseech you, Your Majesty. A royal jester could be a sharp-witted satirist, poking fun at the great and the good.
Enough oiliness here to fry a whole pig.
Oh, stop it.
At the other end of the scale, there were the end of the pier bawdy jesters who were a bit more in your face. But either way, their ambition was the same, to make the monarch split his tights. Our jester was very much in the second vulgar category. His name was Roland Le Patois.
Roland may have had to work his way right up from the bottom.
Early on in his career as a peasant, Roland found that he had a talent for entertaining people, making them laugh. Or maybe he just thought that being a peasant was too much like hard work. Anyway, he used to go down the market square and made a few quid showing off.
But however much he made people laugh, an amateur fool like Roland didn't get much in the way of respect or cash. When there were no festivals, he'd travel from town to town busking for pennies. Oh, okay. And if he couldn't afford props, he'd just have to mime. I'm being entertained by Ben Smith, one of the resident jesters at Warwick Castle.
Ben, your costume looks a bit like something a jester would wear in a movie. Would Roland actually have worn this kind of thing?
Absolutely. So from the pied design of the costume up all the way up to the ears, the ass's ears and tails that run behind the costume, this is a traditional, authentic jester's costume.
An ass's ears because they make you look stupid?
Yes, of course. He was the fool.
What would a jester have had to do?
Some jesters like to employ walking on stilts. Some would like to do a little bit of a dance and a jig, juggling, or maybe playing the lute and telling stories. But the biggest thing was their charisma.
So like today, they would be selling themselves on their personality?
Absolutely, and this was very important as a professional jester.
Simply being a regular jester that no one's heard of sounds like hard work. But how do you break through and make it big? As ever in showbiz, the secret is to create your own special brand.
At some point, Roland discovered he had a gift. Let's call it a talent. Something that set him apart from all the other entertainers.
That wasn't me. Yes, Roland could break wind at will, which is why he was known as Le Patois, French for farter, but more classy sounding. Back in the Middle Ages, breaking wind was just as funny as it is today. Funnier, in fact. It was a whole genre of its own. Oh, pooh. The breaking of wind by all members and species of society was beautifully captured in medieval sacred texts. It was part of life, perhaps thanks to all those turnips. Roland's unique skills were recognised with a special job title. Roland was a flatulist. The most respected flatulists could even play tunes from their bottoms. History doesn't record the precise nature of Roland's act, or indeed what tunes he played, but he must have been very good because very quickly his stock rose and he got a crack at every jester's dream, a chance to appear in the medieval version of the Royal Command performance, which could end up giving him a permanent job in the royal household, Henry II's Christmas show. And he was billed as performing his very own signature act, a whistle, a leap, and a fart. Performing in front of the king was dangerous for a jester. Like that talent show on TV, I can't remember the name of, it could make or break you. Was the king in a bad mood? Would Roland's talents be appreciated? Or would his prowess desert him at the moment of truth? Roland gave it everything. And here Roland comes. He's jumped. He's leapt. And there it is. He's let one go. Oh, what a talent! So, how did the king react? He loved it! So much so that the king insisted Roland return for a repeat performance the following Christmas and the one after that, every Christmas in fact. And by way of gratuity, he let Roland have use of a rather fine house, Hemmingston Manor in Suffolk, complete with 30 acres of land. Roland was made up. He'd got the king to laugh and gone from zero to hero. Now he could indulge in the life of a celebrity. The problem was, tastes change. When Henry III came to the throne, inexplicably, he regarded Roland as, well, indecent. Roland's services to the crown were no longer required. His contract was cancelled, he was booted out of the manor and onto the street. Showbiz is tough, isn't it? You may think that in the Middle Ages, everyone knew their place. You were born to be a peasant or a knight or even a nun. But things were changing, and for some, career options were starting to open up. Take young Simon Winchcombe. This could be him. I said hello. He's an apprentice to this gruff-looking chap. Where have you been, you lazy idle loafer? An apprenticeship could give someone from a poor family the chance to get ahead in the hip industry of the 1300s. Simon was learning how to be an armourer. That's someone who made this stuff, armour. Anyone who was anyone in the Middle Ages had a nice suit. And the top of the range could set you back as much as a very nice car in today's money. Young Winchcombe may have been as young as 7 when his parents sent him away to live with the master armourer up at the local castle. That may sound grim, but if you were hard up, then getting someone else to feed your kid was good news, and getting them an apprenticeship in a swanky profession, that was a result. But for Simon, it meant getting up before dawn and getting straight to work without even having breakfast. As an apprentice, Simon would start the day by lighting the fire and getting the coals blazing hot,
ready for his master to do his work. In fact, he'd spend an awful lot of his time just clearing up the debris that his master had hammered and chipped away. Imagine all that heat and long, long, long hours. It'd be really difficult for a 7-year-old.
Can I go and play now? I'm hoping to pick up some of the skills that Simon would have learned as a young apprentice.
How hot do you have to get it?
Orange.
Graham Ashford is a professional maker of medieval armour, used for jousting competitions and displays.
This way a bit. Towards, that's it.
From around 1300, chainmail started to be replaced by armour plate, especially to protect legs and arms.
What we're making is a van brace. This is part for the forearm. So you're trying to create like a drain pipe, a cylinder. That's it. We'll get that back in the fire.
Am I right in saying that the arms are one of the hardest pieces of the armour to make?
The shape of the arm and the greave for the shin are two of the more fluid shapes that resemble the human being. So if you get them wrong, they're really uncomfortable. It's one of those easy to learn, hard to master types of skills.
Simon would learn to pump exactly the right amount of air into the forge so it was hot enough just when his boss needed it.
We reckon Simon was about 7 when he first started.
Right.
Is it a young man's game?
Yeah. The older armourers have all got some sort of tennis elbow or elbow complaints. I mean, just about everything in these workshops, particularly back then, is designed to either maim or kill you.
Oh, the old smoke's coming up now.
Oh, it's horrid, isn't it?
Oh.
Simon would have had to endure up to 10 years of this without even wearing safety goggles. Until in his mid-teens, he would have been considered a grown-up, a journeyman armourer.
I can imagine Simon doing this hour after hour.
Now he could literally journey from castle to castle, town to town with his tools, doing odd jobs, or attach himself to a master armourer.
Oh, it sounds like a budrigar being tortured. So that will go on my left arm, right. Hey, yes. Nothing can harm me. I see what you mean, though. If it was just cylindrical, it would chafe both there and there.
Yeah.
But now it fits in really rather snugly. Simon's job had lots of other dangers, apart from just running the risk of getting tennis elbow. Throughout most of the 1300s, England was at war with France. It was called the 100 Years' War. A massive scrap affecting the whole of Europe. Made Brexit look a bit like a tea party. And Simon may have got caught up in it. You see, in the heat of battle, a knight's armour could get into a right old state. As a young armourer, Simon would have been sent off to war and put on standby, ready to bash bits of plate armour back into shape while the battle raged. A bit like being in a pit lane team replacing wheels in Formula 1. For Simon, it was a steep learning curve, testing the limits of the technology. He may even have saved lives. On the other hand, while war could be a little grim, it was great news for the armourers, and it guaranteed Simon lots of work. He survived to settle down with a decent income and married his sweetheart, Joanna.
I've done your favourite, quail with peppercorns.
Oh, I think I'm in love. Now they could dream big.
Simon was ambitious. He didn't just want to repair armour, he wanted to create it. He saw himself as an artist. He wanted to head for the top and be a top designer.
I've come to the worshipful company of armourers and braziers in London. It's been here for 700 years, surviving the Great Fire of London and Hitler.
Look at these two, aren't they great, real classical pieces of armour? And you've got breastplates here, thing for a horse's face. You've got these marvellous helmets.
Dr. Tobias Capwell is a freeman of the company and a leading authority on English armour. He's got a finished suit in the style that Simon himself might well have created in the 14th century. English knights often fought on foot, So their armour had to offer high protection without slowing them down.
These are arm pieces. This is actually very light, isn't it?
Yeah, this is the armor technology in the 14th century is about developing a complete, hard exoskeleton for the human body.
I love that word exoskeleton. It's like one of those crunchy insects, isn't it? You just can't get at the juicy bits.
An armor has to be an anatomist. They have to know not just the obvious bendy places, but all the subtleties of human movement. You know, if you stick that gauntlet on, for example, you start to see how subtle that movement actually is.
Oh, yeah, you can really do all that.
This is light equipment that's very flexible and yet gives you extraordinary protection.
The big difference between what we saw on the stairs and here, though, is that this is made of what?
In the 14th century, they weren't really capable of making really big pieces of iron and steel. But these are all little pieces that are all riveted to a fabric cover.
So the guy who would have been wearing this, he's bought it off Simon, but this isn't just one guy making this. There's a load of different skills here, aren't there?
Yes. Part of the role of a master armorer, the head of a workshop, is to be able to bring together and coordinate all those skills.
So Simon wouldn't just have been the artist that he wanted to be. He would have been a manager. He'd have been a big boss.
Yeah, he's probably not picking up a hammer very much at all. And he's coordinating the efforts of mercers and tailors and embroiderers and spurriers.
But why was this place, the company of armourers, so important? Well, it was all about protecting the livelihoods of its members, a little bit like a medieval trade union.
In the 14th century, the armorers were in a very difficult situation because the crown reserves the right to take armorers and make them work for however much money you feel like paying them. They're not allowed to sell to anyone else, and getting political power for themselves is the only way out of it.
With the support of the company, Simon could work for whoever he wanted without fear of being put in the tower. His business took off. But life wasn't only a bed of roses. His beloved wife Joanna died, most likely, as so many women did, in childbirth. Eventually, Simon remarried to Alice. And having come from nothing, he continued to get richer and richer right up to the day he died.
One of the most interesting things I think about Simon Winchcombe is his death, or at least his will. He died in the year 1396. Clearly by that time he was absolutely loaded. The proof is, look, he wanted to be buried in the church of St Mary of Almondsbury, next to the body of Joanna, his first wife. But in order to do that, God willing, they would have to rebuild the church. So he hands out bequests to that church and to loads of other churches, 9 or 10 of them, and other charities and priories and convents and hospitals and prisons, and even to the lepers of St Giles. He gives lots of silver, and this one I find very intriguing. To Richard Person, who is called his servant, he leaves a gown of blue motley and 6 complete suits of armour and the implements of his craft as an armourer. So he's handing over the whole business. And then a slightly waspish note at the end. To his current wife, Alice, he gives such share of his gifts as of right and by the custom of the City of London, and no more. Well, that speaks volumes about their relationship, doesn't it? Regardless of what really went on between him and his wife, Alice, what this really shows is that it was possible for a select few people, if they had the right marketing skills, to succeed big time in medieval England, even if they weren't members of the aristocracy. Tensions over immigration, a global pandemic, trouble with Europe. I am, of course, talking about the Middle Ages.
Although most of the population lived out in the sticks, had no newspapers and their internet was rubbish, issues of disease, Europe and immigration were every bit the hot potatoes they are today. No, they were even hotter potatoes, with some uncomfortable consequences for the lives of ordinary people.
Take young Alice Spinner, the spinster, for example. When I say spinster, in medieval times, the word meant female spinner rather than unmarried woman. Surnames were a new thing, and they often denoted your profession, so everyone knew what Alice Spinner did for a living. Alice was also Irish. She'd been drawn to England in the 1430s by the lure of the English wool industry, which was booming. And one of its boom towns was here in Lavenham. 600 years ago, these funny-shaped houses were the power behind England's most lucrative industry. You see, for sheep, the British climate is paradise. Every spring, sheep up and down the country were shorn. The raw wool was cleaned and combed, and then dropped round in batches to spinners like Alice to be turned into woolen thread. Essentially what she did was this. She'd have this spindle here, which she would spin round and round and round and round and round and round and round, and the wool would get more and more taut, and eventually she'd just tease it out with her thumb and forefinger like that a bit, and then she'd spin it round and round and round and round again and ease it out again. Mind you, she'd have to do it quicker than I'm doing. But even for Alice, it took ages. At a push, she could manage 100 yards an hour. But to make a single dress needs at least 10,000 yards. 2 weeks hard work. I hope she didn't get RSI. She'd have been under constant pressure from the weaver to deliver. But at least the equipment was portable, so she could get out and meet her mates without stopping work. Balls of the wool that Alice had spun would then be collected and go first to be dyed, then to the weaver to be turned into cloth, which tailors could cut and sew to make clothes. An international trade quickly grew up, flogging thousands of tons of wool to weavers and tailors in Belgium, who turned it into gorgeous outfits. But a couple of things happened to change that happy balance. The global pandemic of the Black Death wiped out 1/3 of the population. And war with the French seriously messed up the cross-channel workflow. So Belgian cloth makers fled to England to be closer to their precious supplies. And England became the centre in Europe for the entire woolen clothing industry pipeline, from sheep to well-shod gentry. Oh, isn't it gorgeous? Alice was now at the heart of a roaring trade, a trade that was turning England from a backwater into a regional power. But however much the country needed the labour of immigrants like Alice, not everyone was happy. Many of the English demanded immigration controls. By the 1430s, the war with France was going badly. Resentment was directed at anyone who was French or just a little bit foreign, even the Irish. Which was a bit unfair, as Ireland came under the English crown. So someone came up with what they considered was a neat idea. Yes, you've guessed it, a brand new tax. But not a tax on everyone, just on the immigrants. Including our Alice. So how did it work? This is Leicester University medieval historian, Professor Joanna Story. How could they prove who was foreign and who wasn't? I mean, they didn't have passports. There wasn't a census in those days, was there?
No, they had to ask people's neighbours, essentially. So it was a system that was put in place where the neighbours reported on who was a foreign-born person.
That'll learn them coming here with their weird ways. And how much would you have had to pay?
Well, for somebody of Alice's status, it would have been about 6 pence, which is probably round about 2 days' wages. And that would have been quite a lot for someone of her status.
Could she have avoided the tax if she stayed here for a long time, or if she got married?
Rich people, or people with money behind them, could become natural-born English people by paying a sum of money, but that's very unlikely for someone of Alice's status.
Have we any idea whether the tax acted as a disincentive and that less skilled foreign people came over here?
It doesn't seem that it did. For the 50 or so years after the 1440 tax, there are 40-odd thousand people reappear in those records.
Can you imagine her eventually earning a decent amount of money?
She appears to be independent. She appears to be someone who manages herself. Don't forget that she's a spinner, and that gives us the modern word spinster, which has connotations of independence and not being married.
After several years of poisonous gossip, the legislation was eventually withdrawn. As for the war, ultimately the English had to concede defeat and give up on their French territories.
We don't know what eventually happened to Alice. Let's hope the immigration tax didn't put her off and she stayed put. Maybe she married the weaver of her dreams. Maybe she stayed independent and got rich on wool. All we can be sure of is that while fashions have changed a fair bit since Alice's time, the way people treat each other, unfortunately, hasn't much.